My name's Nick Pope. I worked for the British government for 21 years, based at the Ministry of Defence, the UK equivalent of the DoD in the US. Now, from 1991 to 1994, I held a position where my duties included looking at reports of UFOs that were made to the department, investigating them to see whether there was anything of any defence significance, any interest to the department. Pretty much after I took up my post in the UFO project, I read into the general history of ufology. And of course you can't do that without very quickly coming across Roswell. I guess you'd call it perhaps the granddaddy of all UFO cases, ground zero, the most famous UFO case in the world, however you want to characterize it. It's interesting because in a cultural sense, it's just about the only case where you can go way outside the UFO community. You can stop people in the street, and chances are they'll have heard of Roswell. I was very interested in the Roswell story because a couple of things struck me straight away about this as being quite significant, and they're not necessarily points that you hear brought up that often, but they're points with my government background that were readily apparent to me. Now, the first one was, wait a minute, this is not anything to do with ufologists, because there wasn't any such thing. I think people actually forget that in 1947 there was no such thing as a UFO community. Yes, the media were on the flying saucer story in relation to Kenneth Arnold's sighting, but there was no such thing as ufologists. And in fact, of course, the phrase UFO had not yet been coined, so it was flying saucers and flying discs. But the critical thing about Roswell, the thing that really impressed me about this was not the media running a story. This was not some researcher or some member of the public. This story came about because the US military had proactively approached the media and said, we have something for you here. So this was the US Army saying, we have recovered a flying disc. Now, to me, that's hugely significant. And what then followed with the retraction of the story and the weather balloon story, it's something about that didn't quite gel with me. I mean, this is the most elite military unit on the face of the planet, arguably. The 509th Bomb Crew, the only atomic bomb-capable squadron anywhere in the world, the best of the best. So if ever there's a bunch of people less likely to mistake a weather balloon for something more exotic, that's them. Roswell is important, I think, for two reasons. One, it is indisputably the world's most famous UFO case. So it's, as it were, it's an ambassador in itself for the subject. Ufology doesn't stand or fall on Roswell, but Roswell is arguably the flagship. It's the case that people put out to the wider public and say, but look at this. The other reason I think Roswell is important is that, of course, it's like terrorists say, we only have to get lucky once. I mean, if there's no real grey area, if you'll excuse the pun here. If an alien spacecraft did crash in Roswell, then that's changed everything, whether or not we know about it in a wider public sense. It's very interesting to look at the whole issue of where we are in relation to evidence and proof on Roswell, and this analogy of if it was taken as a legal case, could it be proven? I think the answer is we don't know. There is certainly some compelling evidence, and indeed, in a strictly legal sense, of course, deathbed testimony, of which we have some, is admissible in court. So yes, I think we have a very interesting combination of eyewitness testimony, deathbed testimony, contemporary accounts, the initial report from the US Army themselves, we have recovered a flying disc, On the other hand, I'm not sure whether if you were asking a jury to convict on this, that they would. I think it might be a hung jury. I think people might say, well, there's some interesting evidence, but I'm not quite convinced you've taken it to the point of hard proof. Let me qualify that. I suppose it depends on what legal system you're operating on. If you are operating under the legal system where you have to prove something beyond all reasonable doubt, then no, I don't think Roswell is there. If you are applying the on the balance of probability test, I think a jury might be more favourably disposed to say, you know what, yes. In my 3 years on the British government's UFO project, I investigated hundreds of cases. Ones that stood out for me, I guess, were the cold case review that I launched into arguably Britain's most famous UFO case, the Bentwaters Incident from December 1980. That was very interesting. I was still getting inquiries about this from the public, from the media. Occasionally, questions were even asked in our parliament about this. So I decided to go back to the files to see what we knew, what maybe we'd missed, and it was very, very interesting. A compelling case where a UFO was seen over at least 2, maybe 3 different nights. Witnesses were United States Air Force personnel based in the UK at the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge. Those witnesses included Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, the deputy base commander. There was physical trace evidence in terms of an assessment of radiation levels taken at the landing site. I mean, this wasn't lights in the sky. This was a metallic craft that actually was seen to land in a clearing in the forest. The MOD's Defence Intelligence staff assessed those radiation levels as being, and this is a direct quote from an MOD document, which is up on their own website, significantly higher than background. Now, these radiation levels were about 8 times the normal background levels that you would expect for that particular area. There's a radar operator who says that at the time of the incident he took a call from the control tower saying we have something unknown over the base. He testifies that there was an uncorrelated target on the radar screen for a couple of sweeps. Colonel Holt talks about light beams being fired down from the UFO at him and his men, and how later on in the night the UFO was firing light beams down at the weapons storage area on the military base. So in terms of hard evidence from credible eyewitnesses and the physical evidence in terms of things like radar and radiation levels, this case is about as good as it gets. Another fascinating case that happened midway in my tour of duty in March 1993 is something that is generally known now as the Cosford Incident. It's probably Britain's second best known UFO case behind Bentwaters. This was a wave of sightings that took place over a period of about 6 hours from about 8 in the evening on the 30th of March to about 2:45 the following morning. Many of the witnesses were police officers, and 2 of the locations where the UFO was seen were Air Force bases at Cosford, from which the incident takes its name, and Shawbury, which are about 12 miles apart. A patrol of Air Force police saw the UFO travel directly over the base at Cosford. Then the meteorological officer at Shawbury saw this thing at much closer level, and he's probably the best witness in terms of A, being military, and B, getting a really close look at this thing. He described a vast triangular-shaped craft moving slowly towards the base at a speed of maybe only 30 or 40 miles an hour. He said there was a low-frequency humming sound coming from this craft, which was quite unpleasant, rather like standing in front of a bass speaker at a concert. He said you could feel the sound as well as hear it. He described this thing firing a pencil-thin beam of light down at the ground, which swept backwards and forwards across the fields, he said, as if this was looking for something. Then, he said, all of a sudden, the beam retracted, and this craft just accelerated away to the horizon. In his words to me the following morning when I interviewed him, many times faster than a military jet. And this is a man with 8 years experience in the Air Force. What could I say to someone like him? It's a weather balloon? No. We got testimony from the police witnesses to this, the military witnesses, the members of the public. The Met officer in particular, his account was very interesting. And he said to me, look, I've been in the Air Force for 8 years. I work at a military base. I see fast jets and helicopters on an almost daily basis. I've never seen anything like this before in my life, both in terms of its speed and its acceleration. Governments can and do keep secrets, so it is quite possible for a UFO cover-up to be instigated and maintained if that's what the powers that be wanted to do. Let me give two historical examples. The first is the Manhattan Project, where thousands of people were engaged on a highly classified project, which of course was not disclosed until the bomb was actually dropped. Another example, perhaps in a sense an almost better example because of the time that this secret was kept, is the breaking of the German codes during the Second World War, and particularly the Enigma machines and the work done from places like Bletchley Park in the UK. And even after the war was over, this secret was kept for decades, and I think it was only towards the end of the 1960s that actually it was revealed in a book, I think, that yes, actually we'd broken the German codes in the early 40s, and many of the military successes that we'd enjoyed had come about as a result of that. So that's two fairly high-profile examples, and of course, without wanting to sound too flippant about it, of course, there are all sorts of secrets that government keep from people on all sorts of subjects. I mean, for example, my last job in the Ministry of Defence was in the Directorate of Defence Security, and as you can imagine, particularly post 9/11, there's all sorts of highly classified material going on that people don't have a clue about. So yeah, of course you can keep a secret. I'm undecided about whether there is or isn't a cover-up. I can only really speak with authority about the position in Britain, and to the best of my knowledge there, I don't believe there is a cover-up. I think that government has mishandled the issue. I think investigations have been botched, particularly, for example, the Rendlesham Forest Incident, Bentwaters, one of our best opportunities to get to the bottom of the UFO mystery, and yet because of embarrassment, jurisdictional issues about whether this was a British or American lead, and just simply the fact that there was nothing in the manual to deal with what do you do if one of these things lands. People ran around in circles and the whole thing was completely mishandled. But I think it's a step too far to say that because the government has mishandled the issue and because the government is overly defensive about this subject, no one likes to say there might be things in our airspace and we don't know what they are and they're faster than us. That's not the same as saying we know all about these things and we're keeping the truth from the people. I did that job for 3 years. I had the combination of high security clearance and need to know, so I'm as certain as I can be that if there was something going on, I would have been involved with it or got a hint about it. There is no smoking gun, spaceship in a hangar in Britain. Now, if there is one in America, I don't know about it. So I'll give you a politician's answer. I can't rule out the question of there being a UFO cover-up in the US or elsewhere, but I'm as confident as I can be that the UK has been pretty straight on this issue, and indeed, of course, is now in the process of releasing its UFO files. In a sense, I don't know what the UFO phenomenon is, but I do know what it isn't. And it isn't all weather balloons and hoaxes and misidentifications of perfectly ordinary phenomena and objects. There is something exotic going on, I believe. Now, whether this turns out to be extraterrestrial, whether it turns out to be some other phenomenon that perhaps we don't even have words for or concepts for yet, whether it turns out to be, and this is an area that the MOD did look at a few years ago, with some sort of exotic atmospheric plasma phenomena, for example. Again, we don't know. But like I say, this is not all just hoaxes and people making a mistake. The Ministry of Defence is the British equivalent of the US Department of Defence. So it serves as a Department of State managing the armed forces, making sure that they're properly trained, equipped, and supported. But the Ministry of Defence is also a military headquarters in its own right. So it's not only where the Secretary of State for Defence sits at the political level, but it's where the Chief of the Defence Staff and the Single Service Chiefs sit and direct military policy and operations. My terms of reference were completely UK-based, so I was authorised to investigate cases that had taken place in the UK's air defence region. I had no remit to go beyond my terms of reference. From time to time, we liaised. One example would be we spoke to the embassy in Brussels because of the similarity between the Cosford incident in the United Kingdom in 1993 and the wave of sightings in Belgium in 1989 and 1990. But generally speaking, my terms of reference confined me to the UK, so I can't speak with any authority on the situation in Canada or indeed really anywhere outside of Britain. I've seen in the literature, of course, material about moon bases, life elsewhere in the solar system, alien bases, whatever. I'm pretty skeptical about most of that material, to be honest. I don't believe that the entire astronomical and scientific community would be involved in a cover-up of something like this. In fact, I believe quite the opposite. If they found life, I think they'd be shouting it from the rooftops, not least because of what it would do to their funding, which would go up dramatically, plus the fact that scientists are always competing to come up with scoops, and of course someone will win the Nobel Prize off it. So I'm skeptical about moon bases and some of these wilder stories doing the rounds. But I have no direct knowledge of those matters. It's not a subject that came up, certainly in my tour of duty on the UFO project. One of the things that I think is of most interest and importance is and I don't think they are connected, but I think there's an indirect link because precedents are set, but the ongoing program to release UFO files in a number of different countries. Obviously the British government commencing in May 2008 and running on to the present, and probably there's another year or two to go. British government is declassifying and releasing its archive of UFO files. The French government released theirs in 2007. There's material that's come out from Canada, from Brazil, from Denmark, from a number of other countries. And I think this is very interesting. I think actually it says good things about freedom of information and open government. Whether governments have done this willingly or whether in some cases they've been dragged kicking and screaming into that decision by a combination of the UFO community and the media and people making pretty smart, targeted FOI requests, I don't know. But we are where we are, and it's an interesting situation. We know an awful lot more now about Air Force and government involvement with this subject and some of the cases they've investigated than we knew 2 or 3 years ago, and that's a great thing. I'm generally skeptical about the whole Nazi flying saucer issue. I think it's indisputable that, yes, of course, the Germans were constantly searching for their so-called wonder weapons, but really, in total war, anything they had, they used operationally. So V1s and V2s and some of their jet aircraft were thrown straight into the fight. If they'd got any disc-shaped craft which would leave us standing, I think they would have used them. Now, I'm not saying these things didn't exist on the drawing board. Certainly there is very strong evidence, and in fact I don't think it's disputed that they were working on these issues, but I don't think it got much further than the drawing board and perhaps a few small-scale models. In my opinion, they had not got so far, certainly as producing any operational flying discs. Whether there were some small-scale prototypes or not, I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical. I mean, the British had an organisation called the T-Force, and I'm sure the Americans and others had similar units. These were scientists who travelled right up on the front line, just perhaps a few hundred yards behind. Anything in terms of equipment that was captured was quickly secured and taken back. I've seen nothing in the files that suggests they had any reasonably functional discs that were recovered. So I think drawing boards, small models, I probably doubt they even had a working prototype. I'm absolutely convinced that the universe is probably teeming with life. I'm further convinced, because intelligence seems to be a pretty good survival strategy in evolutionary Darwinian terms, I'm convinced that there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. As to whether we are being visited by any of this intelligent life, in other words, the $64,000 question, are some UFOs alien spacecraft? Again, I'm going to give that politician's answer. I can't rule it out. Sorry, but that's about as far as I can go on this, because I do think it's until I get my hands on a bit of hardware or something that's indisputable. I think what we're dealing with is a combination of photographs, videos, testimony, but we're not quite there in terms of absolutely nail it down and take it to the bank proof, at least not in my book. Further details of some of my areas of research, some documents that relate to the cases I've looked at, some articles on cases and themes that interest me, can be found on my website, which is nickpope.net, and that also has details of my 2 non-fiction books and my 2 sci-fi novels, where I take the UFO theme and decide to have a little bit of speculative fun with it. I've researched a number of areas in the field of ufology. Obviously, when I was doing the government job, I was looking at UFO sightings, but also if we received the reports, which we did from time to time, abductions, crop circles, etc. Anything weird and wonderful. Frankly, there was nowhere else in government to send it, so we ended up as the recipient for all these strange reports. Remote viewing cropped up from time to time, even ghost sightings on military bases, of which there were more than people might imagine. So that was quite interesting. In terms of my primary areas of research, now in a private capacity, I guess the big flagship British cases like Bentwaters, like the Cosford Incident, but particularly the whole issue of why I believe, and air safety is a big part of this, why I believe that this is an issue of considerable defence significance. These are the sorts of areas on which I tend to write. But I've also written on, for example, the relationship between ufology and science. I've also written some speculative articles about what would happen if an incident such as Roswell were to occur not in 1947 but today, because I suspect things in a multimedia society would pan out in a rather different way. So on my website there's an interesting combination, I guess, of factual reporting and more speculative articles. As for my books, my first one, Open Skies, Closed Minds, is an overview of the UFO phenomenon with particular reference to my time on the UFO project. My second book, The Uninvited, is an overview of the alien abduction, alien contact phenomenon. After those 2 non-fiction books, I decided to try my hand at writing science fiction. So I wrote 2 novels, Operation Thunderchild and Operation Lightning Strike, which took UFOs, abductions, some of the related issues, and combined them with what I knew about war fighting and crisis management in government. And I tried to tell a realistic story of alien invasion using real protocols, procedures, and hardware. I think it's clear that people have always seen strange things in the sky. Today's UFOs are the flying saucers of a few decades ago, going back much further, chariots of the gods. Similarly, today's abductees were yesterday's contactees, and then you go back to folklore and the idea of people interacting with the little people. Obviously, researchers such as Jacques Vallée have done a lot of work on that. Graham Hancock has done some interesting work on ancient civilizations, and particularly on parallels between the abduction phenomenon and, for example, the shamanic journey and the other world or other worlds that the shamans can access through using certain hallucinogenic substances and other rituals such as dance and indeed trance. So there are some very interesting things going on. I very much doubt any of this is a modern phenomenon that suddenly mysteriously started in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold and Roswell. I suspect these things have been going on for a long, long time, but we like our labels. We love to label things, and at the moment we've got our labels. Maybe in a few decades' time we'll have new ones. So actually, yes, I think it's very important that we look at the historical perspective here.